Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another OpenShift Commons briefing today. As we like to do on Fridays, we are going to have someone from the Global Transformation Office talking to us about things organizationally transformative or systems thinking. We have all kinds of topics that we do on Fridays. But today I'm really thrilled to have with me again John Willis, who's going to talk about some DevSecOps topics, and his title today is The Blurred and Broken Lines of Defense. And I'm going to let John introduce himself, and we will have a live Q&A at the end of this. So please type your questions in the chat, and we will have a conversation afterwards. So take it away, John.
Hey, thanks, Diane. It's good to be back. It's been a little bit while before I've been on. I love the Friday, the OpenShift Commons briefing is fun. Anyway, thank you all for being here. One of the things, for those of you who know me, I for probably the last 5 or 6 years, I do these I pick a theme near the end of one year, and I start thinking about, like, that's going to be, it's not the only presentation I do all year, but it's sort of the main, like any of the keynotes and things that I might get invited to. And so this is the first sort of attempt at this presentation I'm calling The Blurred and Broken Lines of Defense. So, it's sort of, as it turned out, it's turning out to be a little bit of a meta piece too. So you'll see what I mean by that. But one of the things I would love is, Botch Galoop, there's Twitter handle, Jay Willis at Renat. I would love your feedback, right? Because this is my first version. I think I've submitted this to Swamp Up. It looks like I've been accepted at Swamp Up for JFrog and probably DevOps Enterprise Summit. So I'd love to get any good, really sort of any type of feedback, negative, positive. You could have done this, should have done that. So that would be very helpful. So, all right, let's get started. And so for those of you, so quickly, I don't waste too much time. There's a lot of information about me out there. I'm old as dirt. So I've been doing a lot of stuff. I have like 10 startups or 11 startups and 10 or 11 books. Like I lost count. But probably the most sort of biggest claim to fame in sort of this space is I co-authored DevOps Handbook. I was co-author of a project called, it's an audio book, but it's called Beyond the Phoenix Project with Gene Kim. And then some, I think, really important working groups that I've been on, and I'll talk about these two. The green one, which is DevOps Automated Governance. We're about to start the second version of that, and something called the Automated Cloud Governance, and I'll talk about that anyway. And done a whole bunch of startups, So and I do play guitar too, so not really well, but I do play guitar. So here's the question, and I said that, like, I went down. I had a very distinct sort of motivation for this presentation, and then I started building the presentation. I got sort of very meta in the way I was thinking about where are we at. Like, so DevOps is, give or take 10 years old, right? It's a little more than 10. But 2019 was the 10-year anniversary officially from the first DevOps Days event. You could argue that DevSecOps is about 5 years old. We've done some really good stuff, right? Like big time, like in both of those spaces. And, again, DevSecOps is lagging a little bit behind our sort of all the things we've done well in DevOps. But you know what? Let's face it, it's still a mess out there, right? I mean, that's the bottom line, right? Like, we're still struggling. We're now calling it digital transformation, and that's okay. But like, just these are sort of like, we're having a hard time. The complexity is growing faster than our ability to reason with it. And that's a whole nother presentation. So then the question I was thinking about when I started writing this presentation, which is, and stay with me here, folks. What would DevSecOps, what would the conversation of DevSecOps as a phrase or a term or a meta movement be if DevOps never existed? And the reason I'm saying that is, have we made a whole lot of choices about security with the bias of what we accomplished with DevOps? And then, were those the right choices? Right, and we can talk all day long. Even today, most sort of hardened security people say we still are running on 20, 30-year-old security models, right? And in DevSecOps we've done some very cool stuff, right? Like we've sort of added automation, but in a lot of ways, I guess I'm gonna pick one particular area to sort of explore, which is we'll talk about the lines of defense. But I guess the question I'm adding is, like, yes, it's additive what we've done. DevSecOps reference architectures, putting automation of things that were done manually outside of the pipeline. Yes, 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 all great stuff. But are we significantly making things better from a security perspective? I was going to post like all this sort of the security vulnerability and breaches that just happened within the last 3 days, and it looked like it was going to fill up the screen. Anyway, so and then we put into sort of agile security, and we have those conversations. So hold that thought for a second, and then I'll say, okay, let's go back and say, if I say that DevSecOps is 5 years old, Shannon Leitz over at Intuit. If you haven't followed her work, you should. She's brilliant. She coined it. I think before 2015, but this was a sort of seminal posting that she did, and she owns the sort of coining of the DevSecOps term, because it was actually just, honestly, I was talking to her last night. I wanted to say, like, I showed her a little bit of my presentation, like, am I going to be, is this nonsense? Is this good, Shannon? Make sure I don't make an idiot out of myself, right? And I think one of the things she's great at is, she sees the world, way different than everybody else. And so if you go back in 2013, 14, she's an Intuit. She's trying to solve these really hard problems against adversaries. And she sort of has this, it sounds simple now, this epiphany of this idea of DevSecOps. At that time, it wasn't, because nobody else thought of it. And the thing that's sort of interesting about that is, that first sentence where she said everyone is responsible for security. That's 2015, right? And like 2021, like, we really haven't solved this one. I mean, we're doing a lot of things, but like I do a lot of interviews, and I do qualitative data analysis. Some of you might have seen my presentation, the last one I did on this forum, where I interview hundreds of people in organizations, certainly talk to risk, and I don't get the sense that we're like, we're not even in the B's. We're like C plus maybe, to be honest, in this. And I'm not saying there aren't pockets of like excellence all over the place, but globally, I think we're not. And then, and I think we're still trying to figure out who should do security, right? Like, one of the areas I spend a lot of time is something, sort of modern governance, or sort of a new branding or a new way to think about automated governance. And a lot of that stems for sort of a very siloed approach between risk, IT sec, sometimes the internal audit, which may be the same, not the same, and in dev and ops and infrastructure, and who really owns this, and how And so a little bit of more memory lane. I've been fortunate enough to work in Gene Kim's organization. We write forum papers. There's about 40 or 50 of us to get together every year. We normally go to Portland. Unfortunately, last year and this year it has to be virtual. But we write these papers, and there's been a number of sort of collaborative efforts over the years. The original one was 2015, Unlikely Union, DevOps and Audit. In 2018, there was a sort of tongue-in-cheek Dear Auditors, which was an apology letter to auditors. But it's actually more than that, right? Because if you actually, so maybe the first 3 pages is this apology letter, like how we screwed up. And then, the next sort of 30 pages is a lot of control regs and trolls that we promised to be better at this one. Look at this. And then, a project that is sort of near and dear to my heart, which is in 2019, I got a group of people together as part of that forum: Nike, Capital One, PNC, John Rezzatowski, PNC, Topo Pal, Capital One, Courtney Kisser at Nike at that time, Sabre, Marriott Group, Dwayne Holmes at Marriott Group. Like, there's some other people I'm forgetting, and we tried to sort of proof out, like, how could we do audit efficacy, reduce audit efficacy and toil. And these are all Creative Commons. So, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit, about what we did there. And then one other, I think, historical marker for me, thinking about this whole DevSecOps. For the others who know me, I was the only American at the first DevOps days in Ghent, back in 2019. Andrew, myself, and Damon Edwards ran the first, and actually Mark Hinkle ran the first DevOps days in the U.S. together. We collaborated on that. So I've been in the DevOps game for quite a while. But But the DevSecOps thing sort of started sort of gnawing at me in about 2014, 15. About like, oh my God, we forgot security. Like, how could we make that mistake? Like, and Topo Powell had written this article in 2017, Capital One, about how they did pipeline design, right, creating better pipelines, and they called it. It's kind of funny for you sort of geeks out there. They said the 10 gates that they had set up, which is hex, right? So it was 16 gates, right? But the and they said that. So the thing that you had to read between the lines was they would say they were telling the organization, hey, you have to. They weren't telling the organization you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, and then sort of fight that battle. They were basically saying if you could show up with your service or application, your code or whatever, with these 16 the ability to show evidence of these 16 things, then you will get certain privileges in how you deliver your software. Like one, for example, you might not have to go to a Wednesday cab meeting. Right. And at that time, I was hanging out with Topo, and we were having a lot of discussions about like, well, could we apply a blockchain model to this? And I think the industry found out really quick, like blockchain is probably not a great model. And like what was really lacking here is what the industry was doing great is gating a lot of things. Like, everybody was sort of maturing very well on how do we stop the build if you don't if it doesn't come from source control, or if there's not a pairing on a pull request, or whatever. And then also if it doesn't have, a clean build, or even furthermore in the DevSecOps discussion, does it pass a vulnerability scan? Does it DAST and, SAST, DAST and whatever, software composition analysis, all those things, right? And that's a reasonably advanced model. And I would still argue it was still not changing anything fundamentally there, but we were doing good there. But like another question that was creeping up is back to the audit question. Were we reducing any toil for internal auditors? And were we reducing any toil when it came to control regulations, or GRC, if you will? And were we improving the efficacy of what we were actually capturing? And so the discussion came is like, if we're going to capture stuff for gates anyway, why couldn't we just be building some sort of attestation, digitally signed attestation store? I'll come back to that a little bit. And so the two projects that I've worked pretty heavily on over the last few years is, one called the DevOps Automated Governance I talked about. We're about to start the second version of that, and there's some really fantastic stuff that has been designed and developed since the first paper in 2019. A couple of sort of organizations have really taken this pretty far. We're doing some really cool stuff in Red Hat with it, so I'll show you that. And then another group I got invited to at the beginning of last year, which was a bunch of large sort of telco, healthcares, and financial organizations that wanted to do something around cloud, loosely related to the work that we did in this paper. So I chaired something called the Automated Cloud Governance, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. So, and that actually, we're about midway through the second working group on that. So really interesting stuff, and I'll put it in context as we move. And one of the things that, as we think about the sort of the problem statement of like, in today's world, with all of the complexity that just grows and grows and grows, this is more cloud focused, but this is in general. This is a slide from ONUG, the group that the second working group. It's the largest networking user group. These are people that were heavily involved in SDN definitions, SD-WAN, and now doing a lot of stuff in sort of DevOps, and in this case, cloud governance. But the idea that like the complexity of what we get hit with every day from sort of, just in a cloud world, right, is overwhelming. And at any point, it's sort of a moving target of what your minimum viable security posture is. And so, again, in this reflective mode that I was in when I was trying to put this thing together is, traditional security models are an anti-pattern, right? That's why sort of even the hardened sort of security people laugh at themselves. They're like, yeah, I was just having a conversation with a friend of mine this morning who was like a security guru, like 15 years ago, right? Like insane, like, kernel stuff, right? And then really just gone into a lot of other stuff, like, sort of development, and was pulled back into a deep security conversation. And he started off with apologizing that, hey, I haven't really done anything in security for 15 years. And they're like, you hadn't missed anything, buddy. I had a little tongue in cheek, but again, I think the sort of question then is, Yeah, I mean, DevSecOps reference architectures are cool, right? Like, I mean, like, automating a lot of stuff we did decoupled and manually are now sort of in pipelines, which is good. Sort of our SaaS stats, automated pen testing. But then, the real question is all this, how Shannon uses a term called securability, like that this should be an ability. Can we ask the question, are we actually more secure? And I think, like some presentations, I try to scare everybody to death and show you all the stuff, right? I'm not going to do that this time, but like take it as default, it's pretty freaking scary, the complexity of the problem we're trying to solve and the intelligence of the adversaries. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. All right. So that's a given. And, are we, did DevSecOps like really fix this? Are we, I guess the sort of the main point I'm trying to make here, which is, have we force fitted, remember I said earlier, what would DevSecOps look like if there was no such thing as DevOps? Would we have made all the same decisions about how we are trying to deconstruct or maybe just inherent as is security models, as opposed to like what Shannon tried to do originally in 2015, which was break it, blow everything up. In fact, some of the stuff that she's going to be publishing shortly, which is adversary analysis and adversary intelligence, she's going to blow it up again, right? That's for another presentation. So back to the sort of what is the title of this thing, the blurred and broken lines of defense. So one of the things I hear a lot from clients when I come in, at least clients that are sort of in this DevOps, DevSecOps, IT Sec, and are savvy about the sort of constraints of their control regulations and audit and internal audit. And they'll talk a lot about sort of the 3 lines of defense model, right? And so this idea, if you've never seen this before, right, like there's like the first line are sort of the control owners. And again, like don't scream at me if like, like the IIA or the ISAC, you want to repeat their version, go argue with somebody else. The second line is really sort of control owners. And so the original 3 lines of defense, right, which was, the sort of based on like there was sort of, it's the financial control, the security control, the quality control, right? Like you can already see problems here if you're sort of thinking DevOps. And then you have this third line was internal audit. So like what's wrong with this picture? And for those of you who are screaming out and saying it's been updated, the IIA is updated. I'll get to that slide in a second. But it doesn't look very DevOps. In fact, it looks very similar to that walls of confusion. Everybody sort of has their piece in this almost throw it over the wall, right? Which that's just sort of the dev, space ops, pre-DevOps discussion, right? So I was talking to somebody else about this. It's great to have smart friends, right? About this whole thing about 3 lines of defense, and they, sort of brought something that should have been obvious to me that wasn't, which is the whole Conways Law. And I started thinking like maybe there's sort of a new, it's called the Taylor-Sloan-Conway Law, right? Like, and I won't go on Frederick's Taylor and Sloan and, this command and control structure, but, if you're familiar with the sort of, obviously overused in presentations, but sorry, because I think the reason it probably is overused in presentations because it actually, it helps us define some of the constraints we have in modernization opportunities, right? So the Conway's sort of definition is any organization that design system that produces a design structure is a copy of the organization communication structure, right? There was the sort of original sort of adage that if you have 3 groups working on a compiler, you're going to get a 3-pass compiler. Well, what do you get here? 3 lines of defense structure, right? And then, like I said earlier, like in all honesty, like this isn't like cavemen mentality. They've like in 2020, the IIA has updated this to be sort of more modern, but it's still a siloed approach, right? So so there's a governing body, which is awesome. It actually got rid of the defense to sort of promote a more proactive posture as opposed to everything sort of wait to like it happens and then we got to deal with it. But again, like I will argue that they sort of collapse, the first line and second line and sort of this sort of quasi, you can say, okay, give them the benefit of the doubt that it isn't siloed there. I would argue it still is, but you are definitely siloed from internal audit. And by the way, that's one of the biggest problems we have is the miscommunication, non-dialectic opportunities that we don't have with internal audit or risk when it comes to IT, right? That's why we have thousands of control regs that nobody understands. And I wanted to desk check myself. I won't name the organization, but it's like a well-known Big Four, consulting company who was heavily involved in sort of external internal audits and all that. And in their sort of late 2020 banking regulatory observations, part of the response to the financial sector ISAC, basically, I'll try to read this quick, but another common issue is having so your capability that's missing or in a category. Basically, what they're saying, I'm gonna read it. For example, if the business, if there's first line of defense does not, so they're still using defense, right? Even though the IA has changed that sort of nomenclature. Is not testing capable, risk and the compliance functions to the second line might perform testing. However, if the second line, does that anybody remind you of like where sort of early DevOps or pre-DevOps was about QA and development, right? Like this idea, like the next one will catch it, right? Like it's just not like, and like this is the sort of common mindset that we're trying to sort of force fit into the, oh yeah, 3 lines of defense, yes, fits perfectly with. And I'm not saying this is terrible stuff. I'm just saying I'm not sure that, we're actually sort of thinking about the sort of the security problem the right way. Or having an honest conversation. And so I've been doing this qualitative data analysis stuff for quite a few years now, where I basically interview hundreds of people in an organization. And I have this sort of presentations I've done in days gone by called the 7 Deadly Sins of DevOps. And so I'm thinking a lot about to me, like it all boils down to 7 deadly sin is that, your security, you have security and compliance data, like your audits basically, sort of create incredible toil and have like terrible efficacy, right? And that's even before you get into, sort of containers and platforms and clusters and even worse, like, event-driven architectures and serverless and stuff like that, right? Like I'm saying, you like even in your sort of virtual environments that haven't been containerized or Kuberneteized or OpenShiftized, you're terrible at this. But and the gap gets worse and worse the more you modernize, right? The ability sort of to tie some of the ephemeral activity that happens in pipelines to change records of somebody describing that complexity in human-to-human discussions, right? And that's what auditors are sort of going by. Notice, like, what's the sort of common theme of when an auditor truly doesn't understand, they ask for screen prints. So, like, that's the sort of, you guarantee no, you've not done it correctly. And so the other thing I've been thinking a lot about, so I've been in these multiple working groups, I've been exposed to sort of just a lot of brilliant people who, or, like literally people who sort of run all cloud security for like 5 billion IT a year budgets, right? Like, I mean, it's like a mammoth job. And I've been fortunate enough to these working groups to have conversations with a lot of people. And I keep thinking about how everybody's got this sort of own agenda of what DevSecOps is. And so I don't even want to call it DevSecOps. I'm just saying it's modern governance. But there's something here. And so I was thinking about, okay, what are the things that like I'm passionate about, and what are the things I think that they cover a lot of ground. Like, it's not everything. One of the hard things I find that if you sit down with a bunch of people and say, okay, we're going to say, we want to have a sort of a holistic presentation of you about DevSecOps. And I would tell you, in every conversation that's even tried to do that, it falls apart really fast because there are so many security-related things that are hard to categorize at a primitive level. And I'm not trying to do that here. I'm just saying, like, I'm really only going to cover, probably primarily, depending on time, the first one. And maybe for another day, I'll talk about sort of defense and trust. But I'm been very focused in risk. That's that automated governance stuff I was talking about. which is, what are we doing to reduce, to reduce toil and increase efficacy when it comes to sort of our risk controls, usually around our governance and compliance, and usually comes down to some type of automated form of attestation, sort of evidence in some sort of digitally signed structure, and I'll go into that, or a gating like the sort of Capital One model of enforcement. A second area that I like through the cloud governance project realized that all these people are highly involved in the sort of again, overloaded terms, but they're all building data lakes, cyber data lakes, right? That's the thing. Ultimately, these data lakes are really just elk stacks, right? But and that's not saying that's a trivial thing, right? To build those things is very complicated. To be able to pull and sort of normalize and enrich all the data and get the right meta constructs into a data that actually is searchable and intelligent and can give you sort of predictive I would categorize that of all the work that's happening under what I would call the toil and efficacy of defense. In fact, that's what most of that project is all about, is all the stuff that we get from, say, Amazon, Google, IBM, all the major clouds all have different type of contexts, even though they might actually have the same meaning. But the poor cloud administrators have to figure out, interpret, what was a permissive grant, and how is the wording of that from Amazon versus Google versus Azure versus, right? There's a lot of toil in that. And then how do you get that into a data lake? And if you've seen some of the presentations, so ONUG will have a spring conference, and you'll get to see, if you sort of pay attention, just Google own NUG, you'll get to see some of these companies and the complexity that they're creating on their own. Great data. And then the last area, just quickly, just because I think a lot about this, and I do less work in the third category, which is about trust, right? And that's all related to identity, and I had a CISO tell me the other day, CISO, again, one of the largest defense contractors in the world, said that, John, it's all about identity, right? Like, if you think about all the breaches, like it's some form of sort of, an account that sort of is shared, or it's a server-side request forgery, all the sort of big ones we've seen is all about identity. So then we get into and it's not just getting in, it's like once they're in, how do they find secrets? How do they find, passwords? How do they get into systems? How do they get to the Amazon metadata server and do a fake identity, right? So there's a lot of stuff there, right? So again, I just wanted to get that. So let's talk about the automated governance, which is sort of that first category of risk, right? And so one of the things that when you think about the whole idea of risk, or this way to create digitally signed evidence, as I described earlier, right? You take what Capital One was trying to do with the enforcement. What if we could turn that into digitally signed evidence? So I like to say, think blockchain, but don't use blockchain for this problem. But the idea is that instead of an auditor going ahead and sort of having to go back to a bunch of change records and emails and give me this log, give me that log. How come these two logs don't match? Well, they never will. They're not the same, right? And give me screen prints. That what if we could just say there's basically a digitally signed event that's a list of a digitally signed evidence that's all immutable, can't be changed. In fact, the store is immutable, and you're done. Okay, I mean, there's no discussion. We know that this is truth. And so then the question becomes this verifiable data audit model, which is, how do I prove that I'm safe? Okay, and we do that all day long, right? I have arguments with CIOs, not since I've been at Red Hat, but when I was independent, I would go in, I'd do this analysis company, and I'd start pointing out that seventh deadly sin, and they would say, I would get really upset when I would tell them that their audits are basically theater. I mean, they defend themselves, and then I give them proof about what I learned, and their proof would be, well, no, John, we get awards, and look at our and there are all these subjective things that they say that they're safe. So the proof is this subjective manifest of change records and Archer databases and all this stuff, right? And but then the real question is, can you when they ask me, I'll say, well, okay, here's a story I'm going to tell you that I learned. Tell me how you would demonstrate that that's secure. even though in your subjective model you said it was from an audit perspective? And the answer was you can't. Sorry about that. And so the question is, how do you do both, right? Like, how do you get to sort of both? So then this, what we fall upon, and in fact, this started in the first working group of the DevOps automated governance, is like, how do we move from implicit trust-based model for controls to an explicit-based, proof-based? Sort of the what. And then the how is, how do we change the subjective nature, or subjective evidence, or we just call them attestations, into objective attestations, right? Like, how do we, instead of like having sort of a telephone game of, you know, Sue says it's going to be like this, Bob said, did you do this, this, and this? You know, Jane says, well, it's got to have this if it's going to go in production. And, you know, and then we spend 30 days to 40 days a year sort of reconciling these discussions, as opposed to, we already have the automation. Couldn't we just, you know, create digitally signed events of the things that happen with no human intervention, and have that be the evidence? And so this idea of like sort of an objective evidence and closed feedback loop when it comes to security, right? So let's reduce audit times from like 30 to 40 days a year. So I know banks that basically just have groups that just reconcile audit issues all year long, right? To like zero time, right? It's continuous. It's hit enter. Like anything that gets deployed, the evidence is there in immutable format. And then also, because it's actually coming from the automation, it's not tampered by humans. The efficacy starts getting increased. So the scenarios where the CIO says, well, you know, John, I'm not going to accept that, and I said, well, let me tell you about this this sort of microservice that uses DynamoDB that has this and like that, and a container, and it branches up to that, and uses service mesh, some Istio Envoy stuff to route. Tell me where the evidence is for that. Like, and I'm not saying automated government solves all that, but at least you can have webhooks, have the opportunity to create as much evidence as you have. And in fact, what actually gets more interesting is you move from a reactive mode where most sort of service people, developers, are in a sort of reactive or even conflicting mode with internal audit or risk, and then, oh, geez, they always want us to do this, and the thing I always hear is like, you know, we don't tell auditors things they don't already know. Like, it's a common thing I hear. And you move out of that to a proactive mode where, you know, one of the telltale signs that things are working way better is you see an increase in self-identified risk controls. That means not only are the sort of service delivery people on board with this new way of doing things, they're actually starting to think about how to protect the brand. And is that a latency issue? That might be a brand brand tarnish opportunity, right? So all those things, shortening feedback loops, moving away from cabs, enabling just, I do these loose surveys, but 90% of most controls in most banks are still manual today, right? And so what we did is we structured. Oh, there's one more thing I want to say too. I think this is interesting. I heard Charity Majors say this, and I thought it was sort of a brilliant observation, and I'm using it to extend the observation. So she was saying in one of her sort of interviews, she owns Honeycomb, she found a brilliant woman. She said, she made this thing about if there's a company A, this is sort of a DevOps conversation. I'll sort of give you my DevSecOps spin in a second. If company A, what's the difference between company A, where company A has a couple thousand developers and they're deploying, on demand, sort of all the time, hundreds a day, gazillions a day, I don't care. And company B has a couple of thousand developers, but they deploy quarterly. What is the real answer of the difference between those companies? The real important answer is that company A learns, capital L learns, maybe 2 orders of magnitude faster than company B. Right? We understand that. That's everything we learn from Lean. It's shift left. It's why do we do that? Like, when amplify feedback loops, we want to catch it early so we can sort of fix it early. All right, and it's the whole sort of moving out of waterfall processing, right? Small batch, iterate. But think about where we are with security. We're in a waterfall. Like, the fact that, and because, one more point, this is an important point, is like, when we write code, sort of in the DevOps scenario between those two companies, they're all hypotheses, right? We write code, so it's a little bit art. I mean, some would say it's a lot of art, and they're hypotheses. And how do we actually prove our experiment, right? It's when it's in production. And that's why sort of that shift left, the amplify feedback loops, and the sort of fast iterations is very important. because we learn quick. We get to make our decisions. Well, control regulations are hypothesis as well. Despite maybe what sort of some, Sistine Chapel like building in your sort of financial institution thinks, with the vaults of the papers and the regulation stacks of books. I mean, they're hypotheses, right? And so the question is, if you're doing audits once a year, you have all the ills of what we had pre-DevOps, which is by the time you actually try to reconcile that, everybody's forgotten about it. They've been on like 4 more projects since then, right? So then the question is, are we getting immediate feedback loops on our control? And I would argue that this type of automated governance structure is an ability to increase efficacy through that process. So sort of quote unquote terribly phased DevOpsing security. And so this is a structure. It's in that Creative Commons books that you're sort of welcome to get on IT Revolution. You can download it. As the first reference group that I talked about, we tried to figure out what are the stages and what were sort of the common attestations. It's a really good book for just understanding, control actors and common gating or attestation manifestations. And again, I won't go through all these. And actually, this has been updated to sort of there's some of this in the original reference paper, but it's sort of in my travels and work that I've done internally and externally. Like you can see in the development stage, you might have code quality from SonarQube or customs or change size or cyclomatic complexity. Was there a pairing on a pull request, branching, an optimum branching strategy, clean dependencies, build performance, build version, linting, SAST in the build stage. You can look at, and these are just examples of certain places that we've done a couple of internal hackathons. So we use, some of the easy kill products like SonarQube and, and then artifact versioning. So I would say maybe come from Nexus, meta package, code signing. I'll tell you a kind of funny story in a little bit about code signing, container scan and then pre-pod. And then one of the things that we did after that original, paper is a couple of the organizations, we're going to really address this heavily in the second. Originally we were calling policy code, but that's such an overloaded term. Like, for our purpose, it's really more like a risk as control. And I don't know that we're going to stick with that as the name of the DSL, but this is very specific to the automated governance model I just described. In other words, there would be a collaboration between risk or internal audit and developers. It's like sort of cut out the infrastructure people, like cut out it's like office space. Like, what do you do here? In other words, let's just have like at design and requirements, let's have sort of, risk or internal audit sit in and collaboratively create an artifact that is an agreed communication structure. Because the other problem you have is, unless you're sort of constructing something that the automation is going to use, you're going to have like mismatches in terminology and thinking and context. Whereas this forces you to sort of spell out the enforcement and attestations that need to have. And just the YAML itself creates sort of a meta agreement. Internally in Red Hat, when I got to Red Hat, I've been working externally, and then I got to find out there was like some really awesome projects, as you imagine, as a large open source company that we have, and something that is called the Trusted Software Supply Chain that was originally done as some of the government software factory models that they were trying to sort of drive, or Red Sword they call. And this is really cool. And I'm getting a little tight on time, so like there are lots of really cool presentations here. But this is just sort of foundational. This is an automated governance by itself, but it is, it's just my whole thinking. I really like this one because it's an opinionated reference, but not an opinionated implementation. In other words, it's a composable sort of YAML-based structure to define whatever with sort of opinionated structure in terms of the stages, but completely unopinionated on the choices. Like, do you want Jenkins? Do you want Bamboo? Do whatever. It doesn't care. And it does a lot of cool things. Like not only will it sort of inject like SonarQube to run a scan, it will actually take the artifact and scan and store it. Those are all necessary things you need for automated governance. Because what you'd like to do in the attestation is not only say this happened, but possibly tar and then SHA that log, right, as a mutable event in the chain. So this is brilliant, and so the model then like takes that work with some of the open source work that I've been on in this sort of model that does collecting and testing and enforcing uses a DSL, something like a YAML-based structure. Originally, we were using Graphius. I'll talk about that. It doesn't necessarily have to be with Kubernetes or OpenShift, but like in our examples, we're using OPA and Rego. And then this is the TSSE project. It's actually being renamed to this TSC Python project. And the other thing, again, this is like what's really cool about working on Renat. There's another team that was building basically, what it's called a verifiable audit data store, which basically based on some of Google's work with something called Trillion, which again, I'm going really fast, but you can look it up, is basically a true immutable storage structure. In other words, it just can't be changed, right? Like, so now, like, instead of putting our attestations in this open source Graphius tool, which, has worked very well for the last couple of years for us, but now we're trying to look, because this is based on a Merkle tree, and it's just like the perfect solution for, and some of this stuff comes out of what Google's doing. Actually, a lot of it came from certificate transparency and key transparency, but like you can also use it for this idea of verifiable audit data structure. It's just really, you put all this together, and it's really cool. So here's the sort of obligatory, like, we're going to talk about security, got to mention SolarWinds, woo, woo. But I have a real sort of point here. So, I had the opportunity to do some research about the SolarWinds thing, and I won't sort of talk about why I had to do that, but you let your imagination be your guide. And I went out a lot of places, and like KPMG had some good stuff, and Krebs on software is always good. In fact, he's the one that pointed me to this the CrowdStrike, and they did a fantastic job of how the original kill chain happened inside of SolarWinds. This is like before it gets out to the wildness, everybody, and it's an ingenious. I mean, to Shannon Leese's point, man, the adversary analysis is overdue, because these people are ruthlessly intuitive and creative. And so I won't go through the whole thing, but like one of the things in the blog article, which was brilliant, is they used, if you're familiar with the MITRE, the MITRE attack framework, which is we're using heavily in our cloud automated governance project. So I will say, this is my sort of matrix, but I took directly some of their matrix and sort of merged it with. So here's the point. What I wanted to show is how automated governance might have been very helpful and instrumental for SolarWinds based on the attack surface here. So we'll go through a couple of these, but like the two meta points, and these slides will be available, so you can have fun sort of finding the original article and see how I said, this attestation would have been like incredibly helpful for them. But one of the things that the CrowdStrike pointed out, which was there were all sorts of hash mismatches. So it just, in short, they hijacked MS Build. They basically went ahead and sort of inserted their own code into the build. They did some log masquerading. I mean, they're just crazy intelligent stuff, right? And they were doing it for many years too, so they had a lot of time to perfect their system. And all I was saying is that had they had a really sort of mature pipeline structure, which we don't know, but you have to assume they didn't have proper hygiene. And but even furthermore, if they had automated governance, they could have had there could have been like code signing mismatches. If they would have used something like Trillion as the attestation, so like you couldn't, it's a Merkle tree, you cannot mutate it. Like, so some of the mutations that they did for log masquerading. So I tried to sort of put in like their sort of observation and, and their tactic and ID from a MITRE perspective. So I thought this was fun. And, and I think it to me, again, I'm taking advantage of the situation, SolarWinds, hey, pay attention, everybody. But I really wanted to make the point that had they had automated governance, now automated governance doesn't solve everything. Like I'm not even going close to that. But it's a level of hygiene that can produce sort of a bill of material or something that you don't, like this idea that like when I go in, and Shannon was saying this to me too, like when you go in, you talk to people and say, what's your evidence that you're actually doing this correctly? And if you can't even show me some form of a bill of material for everything that you create from a software factory perspective, then you're wrong. Yeah, I think that's it. So, I covered everything I wanted to cover, and so
You covered more than everything you wanted to cover. There's
yeah,
there's enough tips and tricks here and leads to other topics that we could probably go on for a month of Fridays. Thank you very much for this. I think it's what I'm going to have fun with is getting all of the additional resource links for this
yeah.
cobbled together, I think. So thank you very much for coming, John. There were a couple of questions I think I handled mostly about, how do I get a certification in DevSecOps from out of Red Hat? And, that's an interesting question in that, how would you certify someone in this topic? There's so much to it.
I have dear friends that I really like that actually do this, right? And so I try to be sort of like split the middle, but you can't certify. I mean, again, if the goal is to sort of you've got an uninformed organization that requires it and you're going to play their silly game because it helps you achieve the things that I don't know why this keeps happening, but I better turn this off. But sorry about that. Then like God bless you, just do it, right? But the truth of the matter is, like I said earlier, when I try to sit down with really intelligent people and say, like, what is the holistic landscape of DevSecOps? Is it identity? Is it authorization? Is it, and even in the identity space, is it secrets management? Is it certificates? Is it is it encryption? Is it encryption at rest? Is it does it include discussions about Vault? Does it include discussions about Spiffy and the service mesh? I mean, like, right? And then okay, so let's take another topic, audit. Okay, like forget it. We could spend months on audit. Like, do you got to know Archer? I would say no. Like that's a sort of old way of thinking. You have to know 3 lines of defense. If we talk about if we talk about cloud governance, then oh my God, like, then like. Like what are all the sort of things in SIMs or SOARs or, how do you create cyber data lakes? And then, what role does sort of the traditional SIMs and SOARs give you versus now all the stuff you get from sort of Amazon's web services that are all very immature from that perspective. And then even if you got that right, I mean, like, again, I know I'm over rotating on this, but I want to just make the point why certification is in general nonsense. Because even if I got all that right about Amazon, what if you're going to use Google and Microsoft?
Yeah.
Because that's all another. So, I mean, when we just use the banner, I mean, in DevOps, I will give you a little bit of wiggle room on a certification. Because I would say, okay, if you understood the meta, if a certification test, I still sort of fundamentally disagree with these certifications, but if you understood the sort of meta around certain principles that I think were very important to have in DevOps, sort of the culture, the automation, those things, I mean, Damon coined something called CAMS years ago, cultural automation. Like if you understand those things as primitives of behavior and how the technology and the sociotechnical aspects of it, like I think you can answer those questions to do a pass fail.
Maybe.
But I think when you get into security, you're like evidence that even the security people make fun of their. I just don't see how you. I mean, look at the training you have to just go for SANS Institute just to learn traditional security.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I got to say, don't get me started, but I've already started.
I know. I love getting you started. That's like I love working you up on this. But I think the short answer is like Red Hat certification is specific to products for the most part. There's some and so like there is a certification as a specialist in security for containers and OpenShift on the OpenShift container platform, where you learn all the security bits of that platform, of that technology. But it's not the cultural thing. It's not the automating all of the security and governance and the audit and the risk and
and that's a great point, Diane, right? Because I mean, as much as I rant, but you're absolutely right. Not because I overread it, but you're right. I mean, if the question is like we acquired Stack Rocks, right? And then will we or we will have a certification about the sort of how to use that tool effectively and even some sort of meta aspects of using it. That's a valid certification.
Mm-hmm.
right? Or any other sort of specific tool that we have, like container, our version of sort of container adoption and stuff like that. I agree. But I think I sort of drives me nuts on Facebook when somebody posts there like, I am DevSecOps certified, and like
Yeah.
God, like describe you say like, tell me what you know and
Oh
how
yeah.
you figured all this out, because I've been struggling for at least on the security question for like 5 or 6 years to try to figure out what to, and it was this presentation that finally got me to at least create those 3 boilerplates that I talked about. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and that's taken like 5 years for me to get to even build that slide to say, in my mind, it's risk, defense, and
Yeah.
trust.
Yeah. So if you go back to your, you don't have to do this, but if you go back to your software factory slide, there are pieces of technology in that people should get certified on,
That's right. Yeah, totally.
and should know in depth. But and this is kind of why I have you on Fridays when we're talking about organizational and transformational and systems thinking and higher meta things, that these things are a level above the traditional sort of things that you can get certified on. And
But that's GTO too, right? We didn't spend a whole lot of time. I know our team is on this forum quite often, right? But like we're sort of about like we didn't get hired because we were like Red Hat experts or we knew CentOS or we knew like we got hired because we all 4 of us, Andrew Clay Schaefer, if you don't know, Kevin Bear was co-author of the Phoenix Project, and Jay Bloom is probably one of the smartest guys, one of the top 3 smartest people I've ever met. Like we're all, we try to bridge that technical and social, right? We try to,
yeah,
make sure that we're not over rotating on meta, but we're also like, so we're trying to hit the middle ground, and that's what we do here at Red Hat, and that's our sort of bullhorn too. So.
and that's why it's wonderful having you here and having you back this week. I think that's a great way to wrap this up too. I think that's what you bring, and that's what organizations have to also wrestle with. That this is both a technology issue and problems and things that we can solve with some training and some certifications, but it's also a meta problem and a cultural problem, or initiative within companies that we're thrilled to have you guys here helping us work with all of our customers and ourselves internally too to wrestle with these things and help drive them forward. So thanks again for coming here today, and we'll make this session available up on YouTube. And tell us again, John, what was the conference that you're going to be giving this presentation again?
Oh, so I'm confirmed for Swamp Up. I think that's in May. That's JFrog. So they're great people. I've been speaking at their conferences for quite a few years now. They've got this great community. Their CEO is just a lovable guy, and I like that environment, and so I just have a blast. And so I speak there almost every year. So I'll be giving this presentation at their Swamp Up, and I don't know if I'm confirmed yet for the DevOps Enterprise Summit, but it'll be the first time in since its existence that I wouldn't be speaking if it isn't accepted. But that'll be basically what we call the virtual London.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it'll be April, May, and then I'll probably repeat that at the end of the year for the virtual Vegas. Hopefully maybe it's not virtual by the time I get to Vegas.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It probably will be, but.
So I'll work with you, John, to get some of the, make sure I get the right references in for this. And if anyone out there is watching this after the fact and has feedback for John, reach out to him. Here's his contact information, and join him for further conversations on this topic and others.
Yeah, I'd love any, like I said, the first time I've given it, like, so did I over rotate on something? I would love any sort of really hard constructive feedback. It would be very helpful for me.
All right.
And thank you, Diane. Thank you for you doing what you do. Like it's
right.
great to have this forum to come and experiment and just be part of the community. So
I love giving away the podium. So if any of you are out there and listening to this and have another take on it or a deeper dive that you want to do, just reach out, and I'll definitely give away the podium. So thanks again.
Recording has stopped.
Yeah. So. John, I'm going to edit a little bit off at the beginning where I was talking too much at the beginning, I felt. And if there's anything in here that you felt like you over-rotated on, once let me know and I can...
No, I think I'm